I'm in Central Australia, and behind me is Uluru, the largest rock on planet Earth. Now I'll admit, the term rock is a rather vague one, and barely comes to capture the sheer immensity that is Uluru. A slightly better term is monolith, a Greek word that literally means one stone, that's typically applied to monumental structures that rise forebodingly over the landscape, like the monolith in 2001. And Uluru certainly is foreboding, rising 340 metres over the plain, an island mountain or Inselberg on a flat, silent sea.
If you Google the largest rock in the world, you'll read that title goes to Burrangurra, also known as Mount Augustus, about 1,400 kilometres west of Uluru. Burrangurra is older and larger than Uluru, but the rock is covered in soil and vegetation while Uluru is exposed. Burrangurra is also a conglomerate, which means it's composed of multiple types of rocks of all different sizes, types, and ages.
Uluru, on the other hand, is made of a much more homogeneous material called Mutitjulu-Arco sandstone, the initial formation of which can be traced back to the Cambrian period. 550 million years ago, India crashed into what would become Western Australia to form Gondwana, an enormous supercontinent that covered most of the planet's surface. And in the impact zone, the Petermann Ranges.
About the height of the modern Alps, the Petermann Ranges eroded over the course of tens of millions of years, forming a massive buildup of sediment beneath the inland sea that once covered these plains, the Amadeus Basin.
For the next 100 million years, mud and limestone settled on top of the settlement, pressing down and fusing it into sandstone, until finally, 400 million years ago, there was another violent tectonic shift, so violent that it drained the sea and flipped the sandstone layer onto its side.
Another 100 million years of wind erosion weathered away the limestone to form two monoliths that would become Katajuta and Uluru. Unlike Uluru, Katajuta is another conglomerate made of different sized rocks cemented by sandstone. But while Katajuta continued to erode to form the spectacular rocky domes that can be seen today, Uluru's unique structure and geology protected it from erosion, and so it sat there, relatively unchanged for 70 million years, witnessing the rise and fall of the dinosaurs, while the iron in the rock and surrounding sands rusted and turned red, until eventually, around 30,000 years ago, it was discovered by human beings.
The story I've just told you is the geological one, but it's not the only tale of Uluru's creation. The indigenous Yankunytjatjara and Pitjantjatjara nations, who refer to themselves as the Anangu people, have a tradition called Chukuba, that they've maintained orally through ceremonies over thousands of years. Maintained in this tradition are laws, philosophies, and a creation story.
Long ago, the world was flat and featureless, until the arrival of the Chukuba ancestral beings. People, plants, and animals who travelled and reshaped the land into what it is today.
When the geologists tell their creation story, they point to the vertical features in the rock as evidence of the sedimentary layers having been flipped on their side.
In a similar fashion, every fold, detail, and feature on Uluru and the surrounding land has a creation story and is evidence of Chukuba. Some of these stories are publicly available, and you can read about them online, but most of them are private, maintained at sacred sites around Uluru and Katajuta through ceremonial practices.
Traditionally, only certain demographics at particular life stages are allowed to attend these ceremonies and learn the stories associated with them. And for this reason, there are signs all around the base of Uluru requesting that you don't film certain areas. I could show you footage of other sites and do my best to explain the stories associated with them, but I won't, because they're not my stories to tell.
For 10,000 years, the Anangu people roamed this land as nomads, returning to Uluru and Katajuta to maintain Chukuba, until, eventually, just 150 years ago, their long isolation came to an end.
In 1872 and 1873, Ernest Giles and William Gosse became the first Europeans to witness Katajuta and Uluru, which they promptly renamed the Olgas and Ayers Rock. Over the next 70 or so years, pastoralists and tourists began to flock to Uluru and the surrounding areas, the former hoping to tame the uninhabited centre, and the latter hoping to climb Ayers Rock. During this time, clashes between white Australians and black Anangu became increasingly common. To the Anangu people, Uluru was their Bible, their sacred place, and to climb it was sacrilege. To make matters worse, their very culture was under threat.
See, throughout the 1800s, Christian missionaries were establishing themselves along Australia's east coast, aiming to convert the Aboriginal population by forcefully taking children from their communities and so discontinuing ancient oral Dreamtime traditions.
The Anungu were one of the lucky Aboriginal nations, as their culture managed to survive, but only just.
The missions made their way from the coast inwards. By 1877, there was a mission in Hermannsburg, just 240 kilometres from Uluru. You can still visit this site today to eat apple strudel and explore heritage-listed buildings marketed as remarkable and important chapters in history, with none of the reverence used for other sites of cultural genocide like those in Germany or Cambodia. But the worst was still to come. From 1910 all the way to 1967, the Australian government was pursuing a eugenics program that would become known as the Stolen Generation. During this time, Indigenous children were forcefully separated from their families and adopted by white Australians against their will. Around the same time, this land, which had until then been an Aboriginal reserve, was severely reduced in size to accommodate tourists and farmers. In the late 40s, they added vehicle tracks, bus services, motels, camping grounds, all around the base of Uluru. In the 50s, the Australian government officially bans the Anungu people from entering the land that was now known as Ayers Rock National Park, preventing them from performing the Chukuba ceremonies that had kept their culture alive for thousands of years. And still the tourists kept coming, and the tour companies kept making money. They built an airstrip, then a chain to assist people in climbing the rock. And then, finally, the tide began to turn. In 1966, Vincent Lingyari, an Indigenous man of the Gurindji Nation, led a strike against low wages and abuse at the Wave Hill estate. When the landowners refused, the workers set up camp and requested that the ownership of the land be returned to them. Australian politics were shifting, and then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam set a new precedent by giving the Gurindji partial ownership of their land in 1975.
And it was from this little thing that big things grew.
In 1976, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of Northern Territory allowed Indigenous Australians to reclaim lands if they could prove ancestral rights. For the Anungu people, against the might of the tourism industry, it would be almost 10 years before they obtained land rights, though campaigns did lead to the Anungu people returning to their homelands and the tourism facilities being moved to an area outside of the national park that was now known as Yalara. In 1983, Prime Minister Bob Hawke made a 10-point agreement to return land ownership to the Pitjantjatjara people, who promised to lease it back to the National Parks and Wildlife Authority for 50 years under joint management, provided that the Prime Minister banned the climb. But in 1985, when the land ownership handback finally did happen, it was under the condition that the lease to the national parks was extended to 99 years, and that the Anungu continued to allow climbing, as it was making the tourism industry so much money. Nevertheless, the Anungu had finally achieved official land ownership. Over the next few years, they managed to establish a board of management, achieved UNESCO World Heritage listing for the national park, and officially got the rock renamed Uluru/Ayers Rock, recognising both European and Indigenous histories.
But still, the tourists kept coming from all around the world to climb Australia's most famous inland attraction, and the tour companies continued to make millions. The climb was long and strenuous, and there were numerous cases of tourists defecating on the rock mid-climb. In 2010, a case of a tourist performing a striptease and another playing golf on the rock renewed calls by the Board of Management for a total climbing ban. Finally, the government and national parks representatives came to an ultimatum. They would ban climbing the rock provided evidence that less than 20% of visitors to the rock were participating in the climb.
But the Board of Management complied. Cultural attractions and walks were established to draw visitors' attention to the spiritual significance of Uluru, providing them with an alternative activity to the climb. It's thanks to this move that 3 Chukuba stories and their evidence were made public to the tourism industry, and the only reason why anything about Chukuba is publicly available at all. They also revamped a Wild West-style camel ranch and petting zoo. A little bit random, but still a better alternative to climbing Uluru.
By 2013, the Board of Management had conclusive proof that less than 20% of visitors were participating in the climb, but it wasn't until 2017 that the vote to ban the climb was passed unanimously. Finally, on the 26th of October 2019, exactly 33 years after ownership of Uluru was returned to the Anungu people, climbing the rock was banned and the chain was removed.
Today, you can still see the scars on the rock where people used to climb Uluru. You can also see the rock art, tens of thousands of years old, that has been destroyed by sunscreen-covered hands and tour guides who used to splash water on the sandstone to make it shine. In the tourist resort of Yalara, owned by the company Voyages, you can see how Uluru and its associated cultures are being sold as merchandise, while Anungu women struggle with minimal English to sell their art on the grass outside. Of the fees tourists pay to enter the national park, just 25% is given to the Anungu communities, even less if you ask the local guides. And while these funds are being put to good use in education and amenities such as public swimming pools, these communities still run on diesel, while much of Central Australia has long since switched to solar. At the same time, Voyages continues to make millions of dollars every year.
The story of Uluru's climb is one of greed and ignorance, and it's not an isolated case. In June 2020, mining company Rio Tinto destroyed two culturally significant 46,000-year-old indigenous sites in Pilbara, Western Australia, in the pursuit of iron ore. They blamed the destruction on a misunderstanding, and have since taken full responsibility for the damages caused. But that doesn't bring back those sacred sites, or the stories associated with them. Unlike those sites, Uluru has UNESCO heritage listing. It has the significance of being an Australian icon, and the massive tourism industry behind it. But without those protections, Uluru is just another rock, and that is an awful lot of iron ore.
Thanks for watching. If you wish to help the Anungu communities around Uluru, Voyages has established a charity called the Anungu Community Foundation, the proceeds from which go to health, educational and community facilities. Click the link in the description to find out more.